firstly, it's an absolute honor and a real pleasure to be talking to you about our mile challenge. I mean, firstly, you go back a longer way than you may realize. I mean, starting university and just becoming an amateur runner, you really were the ultimate inspiration, of the ultimate runner, I have to tell you. And I remember you said something in an interview, if you're enjoying the scenery while you're running, you're not training hard enough. I remember that reverberating in my brain. But listen, the context here is I set this mad challenge of running a 5-minute mile. You actually inspired that as well. You recall, we spoke about the Westminster Mile at Vitality.
Yeah, exactly.
There's the world record was, I think, 4:35. And I said to you, could you maybe do it? And you were like, listen, I don't know, I'd have to train, but I'm sure you could. But so that has kind of stuck with me. But what we've done through the Vitality mindset is put this challenge out there. And the purpose of it, obviously, is about physical activity. We know from the data, as you know well, it's just, the power of it, and can we inspire people to do more of it? We chose the mile because there's something romantic about a mile, but it's also a distance anyone can do, frankly. I mean, unless you're very ill, but if it takes you 25 minutes, who cares? Just get up and do a mile.
It's the most accessible of all distances. Yeah.
And then more than that, I think at a higher level, kind of the Vitality mindset is that anyone can get healthier, anyone can make life better. So the hypothesis through goal setting, do you get change? And that's really what we've been probing. By setting goals, not just simple targets, but something that's a bit out of your reach. Does it really take you on a journey that you might not have gone on? And I feel my own journey in this few weeks is I'm on an exciting journey, and who knows where I'll get to. But I mean, my question to you is, there are no better middle distance runners in the world than you. You've achieved it all. I mean, it's remarkable what you've managed to do. My question is, how did you get there? Were these, I know you won races from the get-go, but to get to Olympic champion, was the goal be an Olympic champion, or was it incremental? You kind of just got there through excellence.
Well, Adrian, first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to be talking to you. And we're not talking about lapse rates or actuarial tables or deltas. That's what normally brings us together. So I'm absolutely delighted. We're actually talking about something that we both have an absolute abiding passion for, which is sport, and more broadly than that, human performance. In all its manifestations. So look, I'm very excited to be not only having this conversation, but actually I'm energized by the thought of you taking this challenge on. I don't know who it was that once famously said that some things take insane bravery, but after that you'll be free.
And disgraced maybe, but yes.
I think you know what I mean. So look, we'll come on to the challenge in a moment, because it might be helpful to understand a little bit more about my backstory, because my backstory is a mixture of inspiration from something I witnessed, and then just the hard 10-year apprenticeship. So I'm of a particular vintage. I remember very, very loosely the Mexico Games back in 1968. And there were two athletes in my city, John and Sheila Sherwood, both young, recently married teachers. And they were both in the British team. John famously got a bronze medal in the men's 400-meter hurdles that David Henry famously won in a world record. And his wife won a silver medal in the long jump. They both came back to the city I was brought up in, and they did a tour around the schools with their medals. And they came to my school, and I'd enjoyed running. I'd enjoyed the physicality of running. I competed in sort of school events as a kid, but it was the synthesis of that physical enjoyment and suddenly seeing what that meant to them. I went and joined the local athletics club, which was always amusing to them, because I actually thought I'd joined the club they were members of. I joined the rival club. So little did I know about the sport. And then my father, who was an engineer, very smart guy, started off with a degree in maths. Then he got a degree in engineering. Numbers were everything for him. And my mother was nervous about what her 11, 12-year-old son was doing Tuesday nights, Thursday nights, Sunday mornings, when I probably should have been focusing on homework and all sorts of things. And she asked him to go and find out what I was doing and where I was and why I was spending all this time, you know, at an athletics club. And he had a pretty good background in racing cycling. He sort of got to within sort of national standards. And he started to be, he was a classic engineer. You know what engineers are like, Adrian, you know, that if, you know, first of all, why use one word when none will do? They're not always the most communicative. And secondly, they just want to take things apart and put them back together again. That's sort of in their DNA. And he watched this sort of the early months of this training, probably a year of it, and he's just absorbed it, watched it, understood the dynamic of endurance, and then just quietly turned to me at the age of 13. And he just said, I really don't understand what you're being given in terms of training. It doesn't mean make a lot of sense to me. So from that moment on, he started to slowly absorb it. Well, he became my coach and you know, the most successful middle distance coach of his generation. You know, sadly he's no longer with us, but you know, I've still got coaches around the world that are reading the books and the articles that he wrote. And his view was always, and it absolutely to the day he left us, his view was always, you've got to be relentlessly curious about what's around the corner and what your potential is. And to answer, it's a long-winded way of answering your question. Yeah, you're right. You don't suddenly join an athletics club and think you're going to become an Olympic champion or a multi-world record holder. What you do is you just do it in incremental bite-sized chunks. And I think what he left me with was the greatest gift he could give me, other than, you know, his forensic eye for detail and, you know, the fact that he was an engineer. He just absorbed himself in detail. The most important thing he left me was, listen, if you can run a 6-minute mile, then you can run a 5.5 minute mile. And if you can run a 5.5 minute mile, and we do this properly, you can run a 4-minute mile. And you know, and we slowly built up. So I joined the athletics club at the age of 10. I can tell you, I joined it in 1969, 1970. I didn't get into an Olympic stadium for 10 years. So the second message here is, and you know this, you created a business which is formidable, but great doesn't happen overnight. And I think that's the big challenge now. You've got a cultural waterfall of reality television where everybody sort of assumes you can hit your high spot. You know, you're famous for the famous 15 minutes. It just doesn't work like that. You know, creating a business is probably, before it's even made a mark globally, is going to take you at least 10 years. My own career was, but it was just always, I think he drilled into me. It was always, you know, if I can do that, well, why can't I go to the next phase? And if I can get to the next phase, why can't I? And I know it sounds a bit glib, but if you piece it together incrementally and sequentially, then slowly but surely, you are amassing enough physical and mental experience to be able to hopefully bring it all together when it matters, which for me was really from about the age of 21, 22 onwards. And that's, I mean, that's a slightly long-winded explanation. So, you know, and I think you've got to be enthused, you've got to be excited. And it was Roger Bannister who famously wrote, you know, that when he attempted the 4-minute mile, Adrian, he was a hospital doctor. He had a degree in medicine and was specializing in neurological science. And he said in his book, I knew him well, he talked to me about it. He said the only thing that kept him going was that his brain, if he dwelt on it too long, his brain, including learned articles in the Lancet and, you know, American science journals told him that if he tried to run a mile in 4 minutes, you would probably die in the process. And he said every time his brain told him no, his heart told him yes. And somewhere in all that mix, Adrian, is what I sense is going through all your neurological pathways at the moment.
Well, your incremental, your father's incremental discipline, it sounds super, super powerful. But I mean, a question that's implicit in that, then there is a big goal. In other words, it's incremental. You know, as you go down in time, you've got to, let me wind forward to 41 heady days, it seems like, in 79, where you won. You seem to be in a zone, in a flow. You know, I mean, how did the records just fell 800 meters, 1500 meters. No one had done that, I think, for 50 years. What did it feel like to be in that zone? And is it a specific space where you've like every goal you've had is now, they're there, you're in the space. How did you get there? How did it feel?
Well, I can, again, spool back a bit. You know, at the age of 14, my father, walking off a rain-sodden training ground in an inner city, you know, parcel of land that I was training on, turned to me as we were walking back to the house. And he said, I don't want this to come as a huge surprise to you. I'm 14. He says, but you'll go to the Olympic Games. And he said, I've seen, because he coached, you know, he'd sort of understood the nature of the pressures at an Olympic Games. And he said, I don't want it to come as a surprise to you. And I want you to start factoring that into your head so that when you do get there, you've had a few years accepting that with that comes the pressure and all the stuff that I'm going to give you. I'd love to tell you that the 41 days were quite as carefully planned as we thought. In fact, again, you know, you just seize the day. And sometimes, however well planned and however well coordinated things are, sometimes stuff just happens. You make a big breakthrough. And I was actually, it was the year I was graduating, I was slithering my way to a degree in economics and finance. And I literally had done, you know, like most students, we'd all left it far too late. I was trying to absorb all the stuff I should have probably been absorbing a darn sight earlier in the space of a few weeks. I got it across the line. And I'd done very little training in the process. And I got invited to go to Oslo. And that's a big moment in the career of an athlete. It's a bit like being invited, you know, as an F1 driver to go to Monaco. You sort of feel you've come of age. And I went to Oslo and I spoke to my father literally a day or so before the race, because we ran a business. We had a cutlery business in Sheffield. So he was combining his coaching with running a business of 250 people. I mean, it was quite a prestigious cutlery business. And I rang him up and he said, well, how do you feel? And I said, well, I said, believe it or not, I did a couple of runs over 200 and I'm really running quite well. I was running 21 and bits, which, you know, for a pavement pounder is quite quick. And he said, look, the best thing you can do tomorrow is, he said, go as hard as you can. He said, you may not make it much beyond 600 meters, but at least I'll have a base level of fitness to work with. I'll figure out what the delta is and what we need to do for the rest of the season. So crazily, I asked the meeting promoter, I need to go through in sort of 50 seconds, which nobody gone through that fast before in an 800. And he said, I don't have anybody in the field that can run that, even as a pacemaker. And there was a Jamaican athlete, was actually on holiday, hadn't got a race in the 400. And literally hours before the race promoter went into the stadium, found him standing on the terraces and said, hey, you're going to have to run. And so he warmed up, took me through, and then he dropped out literally at the end of the first lap. And I just held on and I took a second off the world record. It was, to be honest, Adrian, it was really unexpected. I then got invited back to Oslo 10 days later to run in the mile. And I'd only run 1 mile. I was an 800-meter runner. I'd only really run 1 mile or 1,500 meters over once a year for the previous 5 years. It really wasn't at that stage my distance. So I then broke the world record in that and found it incredibly easy. And the worst thing that then happened is I sat down with a group of athletics writers, and a couple of them were historians of the sport, and they said, you do know that nobody in the history of the sport has ever held the 800, the mile, and the 1,500 at the same time. And I just went, oh God, because I love history. You know I love history. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to do that. That was the only one in Zurich at the end of the 41 days that was choreographed. We had pacemakers. We did everything. You know, NBC went live, BBC cut in for the very first time to the 9 o'clock news. And it was the hardest of them all. I only managed to take about 1/10 of a second off Philbert Bayi, the famous Tanzanian athlete's time. So that was a wonderful way to come out of a season where I'd actually graduated, but it also left me in a level of massively heightened expectation 1 year out from the Olympic Games. So the upside was doing what, you know, nobody had ever done before, but I was then in everybody's crosshairs, you know, and most of the British media assumed that I only had to turn up in Moscow to win, which clearly was a ridiculous nostrum. And secondly, I managed to prove them wrong rather spectacularly.
But let me ask you a question. I'd like to probe it. Let me ask you a question. The people set goals, and they don't. In fact, people often don't set goals. But when they do, if it's really tough, they often drop out of it. I mean, in your case, the pain. I mean, it's easy to tell a story, but the pain you went through in these runs to achieve these goals, it's intense. I mean, what was that like to push at that pace? I'm just intrigued with what it takes to achieve a goal in life. It requires sacrifice. It's not simple. So, you know, you obviously got a talent that's beyond mere mortal. But my question is, how was the pain? How hard were you pushing yourself?
Well, I hate to sort of disabuse anybody listening to this. Actually, there's nothing in any race I've ever run that I found even half as hard as the average training session. So I guess there's a really important concept here. And it really doesn't matter what form of human performance you're in. The reality of it is, and I think anybody in business, in philanthropy, in the arts, culture, politics probably, the one thing I would say is I never ever wanted to be in an Olympic final or a major race where I was ever concerned that I would get thrown something in the course of that race that I hadn't dealt with 1,000 times before on the training track. So in simple terms, it's a forensic eye for preparation. And, you know, there were training sessions where, you know, there were weight training sessions, Adrian, where I would work for 2 hours relentlessly. And I would go back to the car at the weightlifting center with my coaches, and I'd have to sit there for half an hour before I could actually open my hands enough to hold the steering wheel of the car. I ran one session before I broke the mile world record in Brussels in 1981. And a week before that, I ran 6 by half a mile, 800 meters, with a 45-second recovery. And they all averaged 150, 152, and one of them went under 150. So in simple terms, it's really the ability to absorb the pain. And yes, it's a painful process because everything you do in middle distance running is geared to dealing with massive buckets of lactic acid. And again, you love numbers, that's what makes you tick. I'll give you a couple of numbers here. If you run an 800 meter world record pace, you're basically running about 20 miles an hour the whole way, possibly a little bit quicker in points. You can't absorb more than 20% of the oxygen that you need to get through the race without going into oxygen debt. And you go into oxygen debt pretty quickly. I mean, it's unremitting. And while all this physiology is sort of collapsing around you, you are expected to be making split-second tactical decisions about whether, is that, and in traffic. So you're fighting for a space that is probably 8 square meters on the track with 9 other people. If you're strategic, you want to be sitting in the middle of the field, not showing too much, but you then got to make a judgment as to, through the traffic, whether somebody's 5 paces ahead of you or 3.5 paces. You get that wrong, that delta is going to be the difference in losing. It's where you're going to trail in behind. It's like a game of high-speed chess. Yeah. And you're looking for exits and routes out. And if somebody comes on the inside, where do I go? Do I, it's all the time. So there's a lot of mental, focus, and you're trying to do all that while in essence, physically, your body's closing down around you. So being able to think under pressure, and again, it's a concept that everybody, at high levels of performance, is probably the most important thing we can do. We do it in our businesses. Sometimes we do it in our own families, having to, think things through. And so for me, everything was geared in training to speed endurance, so that everything I would be confronting or faced on a track in a race I dealt with before. And it also allowed me to have a range of tools, a range of weapons in the armory. So if somebody went out hard, I knew I could deal with that. If I needed to impress myself on the race, I could go out hard. But I also knew that the work I did in terms of sprints and speed drills and coming off the bend and, kicking for home, and you do that thousands of times on the track, that if it was a tactical race, I would also be in the mix there. So it's basically covering every base. So yeah, the races were tough, but they weren't in the foothills of how tough the training sessions were, mentally and physically.
That's incredibly profound. I mean, your whole approach is cerebral and tactical. I mean, let's say your father had this, rigor from engineering. It's extremely profound to kind of extrapolate that to any goal. I mean, I was at a lunch with you in London where you spoke, and I was really inspired by, it's obviously, as you tape it off, but you made the point about when you decided to stop running. It seemed like a moment in time. It wasn't incremental. You took a view. What happened? When did you decide it's enough? You've achieved everything. How did that play out?
It's a long time ago now, but I can remember it as yesterday. It was at the end of the 1989 season. I'd finished second at the end of that season in the World Championships. I was 34, which was actually a pretty credible performance. I'd finished number 1 on the ranking list in my own country, in Europe, and large parts of the world at 8:15 and 1 mile. And I was out running early one morning. I was doing my mileage. I used to live out in southwest London near Richmond, Twickenham on the river. And I sort of was probably 7 miles into the run. I got another 2 or 3 miles. And my mind interestingly started to think about the coming season. And at that point in the year, I'd always been able to sit down and think, right, okay, what are the adaptations I need to make in order to maintain primacy and market, market position? It's like a business. What is it? You and I are going to be a part of a strategic 2 or 3 days in a week or two in the business. And, that's why we're there. it's stock taking. It's an opportunity to go, okay, we've got it to here. We want to get it to there. What do we need? What skills do we need? What adaptations? What modifications do we need to make? An athlete goes through or should go through the same process at the end of each season. And I don't know why, it just kicked in towards the end of the run. And I'd always been able in previous years to think about mixing the training, mixing the, changing the mix between endurance, speed endurance, flat out speed, maybe doing something slightly different in terms of conditioning work, maybe changing, the environment, maybe even going overseas, doing something different. And I don't know why, but every time I started to think of something I could do, I came to the immutable conclusion that, yes, I was probably smart enough and still good enough to go on winning races, and probably winning races because I knew more than maybe some of the younger, talented athletes coming through. But I just couldn't get beyond the concept that I would probably never run faster. And that answered the question that everybody used to ask me from the moment I began to get a profile in the sport. What is it that motivates you? I couldn't have answered that question then. On that day, I knew the answer. And the answer was, I just wanted to plumb the depths of my own potential. And if it took me to world records or Olympic medals or, European championships, Commonwealth championships, then great. That in a way was the byproduct. But the primary inspiration and focus was about just how far can I take this bloody experiment before I reach the end of the road. And it was odd. I finished the run. It was the infancy of mobile phones, so I did get on the phone to my coach. And it was a wonderful guy, my father, very, very funny. You'd have really loved him because he had so many of the traits you had. And I said to him, Dad, I'm calling it a day. And he went, oh, thank God for that. He said, I thought you were going to retire after 1984. He said, you gave me 6 more years of this. I said, well, and I went on running. I kept moving. I loved exercise. And the other thing that came through was a lot of athletes just never, ever go back to running. I couldn't imagine a day without running. It's what I do. And so that was the day I retired. It was as simple as that. There was no long agonizing, well, I could do this, I could do that. I just, I got back to my kitchen, picked up the phone, and we had supper that night and had a laugh about my career.
But when I heard it, it struck me as unbelievably wise and decisive. But I think we should point out here, which really is, very few of us ever get the chance to feel you've actually achieved your potential. You know what I'm saying? We all, I think 99.99% of people never feel that ability to say with comfort, I've achieved it. It's an amazing thing. Let me ask you, push on a bit. I mean, again, very few people, you became a member of parliament. You then ran the 2012 London Olympics. I remember the narrative around the Olympics. We'd never achieve it. It's not going to come off. We've got to build these, the whole thing was full of doubt. How did you led this entire thing? It was like a nation state of complexity. I mean, the lessons from setting goals, it's a big goal, managing a team. I mean, what advice or what learnings can you?
Well, I wasn't, interestingly, I wasn't the first choice to chair the bid. It was given to an American lady who actually, in fairness, a bid is really like a startup. You set out the vision, and British government, the British Olympic Association, the Mayor of London, they appointed a lady called Barbara Cassani. She got British Airways experience, American lady. And the startup was a good startup. She brought in some good people. But we weren't making the kind of progress that we should have done. And I was watching this, and I was doing my bit when I was traveling, and my International Olympic Committee work, and obviously through my sport to promote London. And to cut a long story short, the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, decided he wanted a change of emphasis. And unusually, and this spoke a lot for Tony, because he could have been very politically tribal about this and gone for somebody that was of his political persuasion. I was chief of staff in the Conservative Party, so I got to know Tony quite well, because I worked with William Hague, who was our leader and then became distinguished foreign secretary. And he rang me up absolutely out of the blue and said, the current chair has decided to step down, and I want you to do this. So I went away and thought about it, and then rang back the following day and said, look, yeah, it will be a great honor, but we're coming from a long way back here. There were 5 cities at that point, and we were a poor 4th. We'd only just snuck across the line in terms of the initial evaluation. And there were some things I learned quite early on. And I think you know me well enough to know that I like people that are absolutely focused and believe in what they're doing. And I'm choosing my words carefully. I've probably never really articulated it the way I'm going to now, but I think you'd understand this. I walked into the organization the following day that I got the appointment and introduced myself. And there was a lot of nervousness. People didn't know what I was going to do. And people were a bit perplexed about the speed with which it had happened. And some thought that I had been instrumental in it. I can absolutely tell you, I knew nothing about it until I was asked by the Prime Minister. And I looked at everybody sitting there and I thought, well, this isn't going to be perfect, pristine HR, or now we call it people and talent. But I went around all 60 people in the bid and I asked them what they wanted to do after the bid was over. And those that said, well, I'd really like to go back to Goldman Sachs or Deloitte or to my university teaching post, I said, go now. Absolutely go now. Because if you are even thinking that we can't win this, I don't want you on the team. And I'm not talking about your skills. I'm not talking about your abilities. I just haven't the time to have people on this journey that when the boat starts to rock a bit, is not trying to figure out how to get it into harbour, but their first instinct is to look for the life belts. I can't do that. And everyone that said to me, I would love to be your director of transport, or I would really love to be in the communications team, or I would really love to figure out the complexities around operational delivery and strategy management. I said, fine, that's great, stay. I want you here. And so it was a bit nerve-wracking because I think in the space of about 48 hours, I'd shown 30 people the door. And I then started to recruit people who I knew would absolutely die in a ditch for this project because we barely had a year. And then the other thing that was interesting to me, and look, I'm not a Harvard MBA, I'm not suffused in, academic management speak, but there was something else that became pretty clear to me, that, we all ask the same questions in our businesses. We ask the how and the why. And I'm not saying the how isn't the right question to ask. Of course it is. When you're putting together a project that demands that you are effectively pulling together 52 simultaneous world championships in 10 days with all the operational overlay and complexity. I mean, it dwarfs almost any project management any city undertakes. Of course, the how is important, but what we'd failed to ask ourselves in the initial phase of that was, why are we doing it? Why are we getting up in the morning and doing what we're doing? Why do we want to be the best mining business in the world, the best insurance business in the world? There has to be a vision, and there has to be an optimism, and there also has to be a moral purpose, a shared value. Why are we doing this? And so I cancelled every meeting in the building for a week. And I said, it's not going to make a jot of difference to whether we win or lose, but if we don't have meetings. But the difference between winning and losing is going to be all of you working flat out and probably saying goodbye to families and sweet spots in your own career. You didn't need to do this. You know, I can't financially reward you anywhere near what you are probably getting at this moment. So me included, we all need to know why we're doing this. And slowly but surely, we began to articulate that within the organization. And once you'd started to articulate it within the organization, it made it very much easier for me to go on Radio 5 or BBC or ITV or CNN and capture it very quickly, the essence. And for me, it was really simple. There was no other project in the history of my country that so had the ability to position ourselves in terms of brand value and how we saw ourselves as a nation, as welcoming, open, multicultural. I'm part Indian, you know, that I feel really strongly about. That's why I like spending time in South Africa. You feel an optimism and a massive future. And so slowly but surely, we did that. And having articulated it internally and then delivered the articulation externally, we suddenly went from an approval rating from what we were doing of about 15% to, when we got to the games, 80% of the nation in one way or another could see the value of what we were doing. It also allowed everybody at whatever level in the organization to feel that when they came into the building, didn't matter whether they were at the front desk or in your position, everybody knew why they were going into that business and what ultimately they wanted to achieve. And that was how we did it. And actually, funnily enough, the hard grind of delivering the 7 years of the championships is tough enough. But actually, I think that year where I had to build a team, create an international narrative that was going to be front runners like Paris and Madrid and New York, and do it without losing faith or, you know, the troops all coming back down the mountain halfway up, was I think it was probably the toughest assignment that I've had.
That's remarkable. I mean, it's an incredibly inspiring story. To make the point, you're connecting the dots. I know they're not the same, but you're plumbing the depths of your potential is a why. The how is a training. So, you know, you clearly coded for why, you know, which is profound. The how is tactical. And you did the same in the Olympics, you know, just getting people to understand the power of that. Very powerful. I mean, that's, let me ask you a last question.
Yep.
You know, as people get older, they don't set goals, you know. I mean, what are your thoughts now? I'm kind of want to tempt you into trying a mile. I'll do it with you. I'll be behind you after about 2 meters. Be that as
you won't actually, Adrian. You're a lot fitter than you think you are.
I hope you're right. But thoughts for the future, some exciting goals. I mean, you've got a big job with World Athletics. You've done it all. I mean, it's remarkable.
Well, look, I'm very lucky. I'm really lucky because I love doing what I'm doing with Vitality, Discovery, other outside relationships that I have. And look, I guess it's part of my DNA, but I just like spending time with people who have got a vision and care about things. And every relationship I have, that's probably the most important thing for me, is that when you join an organization, it's like joining an extended part of your family. And, you know, you share the great moments, the excitement of success, and you share the duller moments where the flip side of that is it doesn't always work out, but you know, it's a bit of a cliche, but you do get back up and you soldier on. So the great my motivation is I just don't know what's around the corner. You know, if I look at world athletics, yeah, we had as you guys were really supportive, but I had the nightmare start where, the police raided the office. My predecessors were, arrested for embezzlement. That's not the opening paragraph of an obviously happy ending when you're taking a new sport on. But, we turned the corner on that, and, we're now in really good shape. And all the businesses that I work in, I'm equally excited about, because, my relationships tend to be long relationships. So I've watched the development, sometimes the genesis of something which in your wildest dreams could you not imagined getting to where it has. So I just love being part of a team that's hungry and ambitious, but got everything in proportion. And so I don't think there's any one thing that I'm looking at and thinking, oh, by this time next year, I want to be doing this, that, or the other. I just sort of, it sounds a bit happy-go-lucky, and I guess to a certain extent it is. I've never predicated the jobs I've done sometimes on the risk either. If I'd been risk averse, I probably wouldn't have gone into politics at the wrong end of an electoral cycle. If I'd been risk averse, I was told in the early days I was never going to be fast enough to be an 800-meter runner and never tall enough to be a miler. Well, there you go. When I took the bid on, we were 4 in 5, and with not that obvious a chance, Paris were absolutely odds-on favourites. I took World Athletics on at a time when, it wasn't the easiest thing to do. So I tend to do the things, I'm lucky, I tend to do the things I'm passionate about. And I'm being very lucky in that I learn something from somebody every day of the week. And it really doesn't matter what age they are. There are 35-year-olds I wouldn't leave in charge of the remote control on my television set. And there are 85-year-olds that I will spend hours with, because their wisdom and their experience is something that you have to treasure.
Sure. Seb, let me end by thanking you. It's been spellbinding, inspiring wisdom and clarity, and the why, of the goal is the key issue. Fantastic. Thanks for the time, and just look forward to many years working with you, listening, learning. Great. Fantastic. Thank you.
Looking forward to seeing you in a few weeks.